So at the end of the last video I did talking about Star Wars and Star Trek, I mentioned a possible head-to-head matchup between the two universes, and I said that Star Wars having the Force was an important factor in that discussion. Let's just say that the comments had a few opinions on that statement. Okay, yes, I know about Q. He is essentially a god. Of course, if you were to have him fight a Jedi, even the most powerful of Jedi, like Yoda or Luke, Q could just snap his fingers and win. They are on completely different levels of power, which is why I think it makes far more sense to compare Q and the rest of the continuum to the Star Wars gods, known as both the Mortis gods or the Ones. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to say that comparing omnipotent beings, especially in two different fictional universes, is very difficult. And frankly, deciding on who would come out on top is borderline impossible. Instead, what I am going to do in this video is lay out the powers and weaknesses of each individual, and then I'm going to let you decide who you think would be victorious. Starting with Q, we were first introduced to this character in the pilot episode of The Next Generation, and over the course of many years and several TV shows, we learned a lot about his personality and his powers. They include, but are not limited to, time travel, teleportation, changing the laws of physics, telepathy, matter manipulation, and possibly immortality, and I'll elaborate on that one in a minute. We have seen that Q can also extend the use of these powers to other individuals, such as when he offers the powers of the continuum to Riker, when he has Picard time travel to the past, or when he brings the crew of the Enterprise into fictional worlds made real. As to the weaknesses of the Q, there are several. If the continuum so decides, they have the authority to strip an individual Q of all of their powers, which we see happen in The Next Generation. We have also seen the Q continually underestimate the cunning and fortitude of species not of their own. Okay, as to their immortality, this is where it becomes a little murky. When Q was stripped of his powers, he attempted to sacrifice himself to save the Enterprise, and as a result, had his powers restored by the continuum due to his selfless act. This was our first evidence that a Q was not indestructible, but in all fairness, this version of Q had been made fully human, so he didn't have his powers at the time. Our first official confirmation that a Q could die came in the Next Generation episode, True Q. In this episode, we learn of the Q Amanda Rogers, who was born to two members of the Continuum, who had voluntarily assumed human form. The two were executed when they proved unable to abide by the agreement they made not to use their powers as a condition of living as humans. The mortality of Q later became a major issue in the Picard series, where we saw Q gradually lose his powers and eventually die, though he would later appear alive at the end of the series when he visited Jack Crusher, leading to a number of fan theories as to whether he was truly dead, or if this was just a past version of Q, since time travel is one of their powers. Or perhaps death just means something different to them.
You have no idea what it means to be Q.
Now, on to the Mortis gods. We first met this race of Supreme Force users in the third season of the Clone Wars. Unlike the members of the Q Continuum, who seem to have uniform powers across the board, the Mortis gods have powers that are based on which affinity of the Force they belong to. In the Clone Wars, we met three of them: the Father, the Son, and the Daughter. The Son was the embodiment of the dark side, and as such, one of his powers included a mastery of Force lightning. The Daughter was the embodiment of the light side, and as such, had a mastery of Force healing. And the Father was the holder of balance. The powers all of these gods can utilize include shapeshifting, teleportation, time manipulation, and a complete mastery of all force powers on their side. Since the father is balance, it is assumed that he has a mastery of both sides. Their immortality, like the Q, is also a little murky, which again, I will elaborate on later. The weaknesses of the Mortis gods mainly rely on Anakin and his status as the Chosen One. The father, as the holder of balance, was responsible for keeping the son and daughter in check. However, his love for both of them and his increasing age contributed to his grip slipping, and resulted in the son rebelling as the dark side was in his nature. Anakin showed that he could subdue both the son and daughter simultaneously, meaning that the Mortis gods were theoretically susceptible to the abilities of a normal Force user. However, since Anakin was the Chosen One, it could be that this was a power unique to him, and not an overall weakness to consider in the Wars vs. Trek matchup. The Mortis gods' mortality used to be a more settled question. While they were arguably omnipotent by Star Wars standards, we did see that they could be killed by the dagger of Mortis. The son attempted to use the dagger to kill his father, but he accidentally killed his sister instead. The father would later use the dagger on himself, and this would weaken the son enough for Anakin to kill him with his lightsaber. However, whether the Mortis gods were truly killed is not clear. We know an essence of the daughter does live on in Ahsoka, and at the end of the Ahsoka show, we got a hint that the Mortis gods might still be out there when we saw Balin's skull stand on their statues as he looked out at the Force calling to him. Just like with Q at the end of the Picard show, it seems there is more to this story. There is another Mortis god I have yet to mention, Abeloth. I want to discuss her separately since she does not exist in Star Wars canon, but we did learn about her in Legends. Abeloth, also known as the Mother, was formerly a human woman who had become arguably the most powerful Force user in the whole Star Wars galaxy. She drank from the font of power and bathed in the pool of knowledge, both of which were Force nexuses, and as a result, gave her an unprecedented connection to the Force and the dark side. On top of the powers already described, Abeloth had the abilities of mind control and body possession. However, she was not infallible and was eventually subdued by Luke Skywalker, who went on to look for the Mortis dagger as a way of permanently ending her. When comparing Q and the Mortis gods, the question of who would come out on top, in my mind, has two considerations. First is obviously the mortality of each group, since whether or not they can truly die seems to be an open question for both. It is hard to say whether either side can ever really be victorious. The second consideration is how the rules of the Force would govern the Q's powers. Would the Q simply be able to snap their fingers and take the Force away from the Mortis gods? Or would this be a limit forcing the continuum to come up with other options? So let me know. What do you think of the powers of Q and the Mortis gods? How would you handle the two issues I just brought up? Do you think there is an obvious victor between the two? Put your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any future content. With all that said, have a great rest of your day.